I was taught creationism as science, not theology, not this is what our family believes, science. And I didn't realize how much that shaped the way that I understood evidence until I went to public school. When I went to public school in 10th and 11th grade, suddenly the answers that I had learned in my Apologia science textbooks were wrong on all of the tests. I'd been taught that Earth was only a few thousand years old, that evolution was basically incompatible with creation, and that radiometric dating was unreliable. Then I got to public school and they were teaching billions of years, evolution, geological time, all of it. And I didn't just quietly give the teacher the answer that she wanted. No, I would literally fill in the scientifically accepted answer on the test and then write in the margins what the Apologia textbooks had taught me. And my teacher would argue with me about it, and she would try to explain the evidence and explain why the science worked. It worked, but I was completely torn because by that point, I had subconsciously absorbed this idea that it wasn't just a disagreement about geology or biology, it was a disagreement about God. I had been taught that if I accepted evolution or an old earth, that I was accepting a secular worldview that excluded God. So even when the scientific evidence made sense to me, believing it felt spiritually dangerous. I genuinely did not understand that I was allowed to believe both, that God created the universe and that the earth was more than 6,000 years old. And that conflict eventually became part of why I became agnostic for a while, because I thought I had to choose either Christianity was true and science was wrong, or science was true and Christianity was wrong. What I didn't understand yet was that this was a false binary that I had inherited. And ironically, Islam was what finally broke it for me. Because when I actually studied Islam, I realized that it did not require me to reject an ancient earth, evolution, archaeology, or scientific evidence in order to believe in God. And before I get there, I want to explain how Apologia got me to that point in the first place. Because the weird part is I already understood how science worked. From the time I was like 5, I was getting highlights magazines. I read every single page. I was reading encyclopedias for fun. By 6 or 7, I was Googling scientific journals about random topics that I was interested in. I understood experiments. I understood hypothesis. I understood classification, genus, species, how scientists tested ideas. So for years, I wondered if I already understood the scientific process. Why did I take Apologia so literally? And I think I finally understand why. Because knowing how science works is not the same thing as recognizing when someone is quietly changing the rules of evidence around one protected conclusion. Apologia didn't tell me don't think. It talked about evidence, experiments, assumptions, counter examples, scientific controversies. It felt analytical, and that actually made it more persuasive. I wasn't being told not to reason. I was being given premises that made a predetermined conclusion look like the result of reasoning. And radiometric dating is a perfect example. I went back, I found the actual second edition Apologia material that I was taught from, and in the section about dating, students were taught that while radiometric dating can calculate an age, most forms of radiometric dating were unreliable, and that carbon-14 dating was only about as reliable as tree ring dating for things that were less than 3,000 years old. The material also emphasized that calculated ages depend on assumptions. And technically they do, but that's not the dishonest part. Science absolutely makes assumptions. The question is what scientists do with them. With radiometric dating, scientists have to ask things like, was the sample contaminated? Did material enter or leave the system? Was the sample altered? Are we using the appropriate dating method for this material? Is the expected age even within the useful range of this isotope? These are the real scientific questions. But Apologia taught me something much more subtle. It trained me to hear this method has assumptions and mentally translate that into, therefore, this method cannot be trusted. Those are not the same statement. I specifically remember these strange dating examples being used to show that radiometric dating was unreliable. Things being dated to ages we already knew were impossible. Different measurements apparently producing wildly different ages, recent volcanic rocks being assigned ages of millions of years. And when I went back looking for where the teaching came from, Apologia's own supplemental material directs students towards young Earth creationist sources built around exactly those types of anomalies. One commonly cited category involves potassium-argon dating. Sometimes volcanic rocks can contain inherited or excess argon. If you use potassium-argon dating with an unsuitable sample, that extra argon can produce an apparent age that is much too old. And creationist materials would point to results like that and basically say, see, radiometric dating doesn't work. But that's where the reasoning is stopping too early, because an anomalous result is not the end of science. It's the beginning of another experiment. The scientific response is, why did that happen? Was a sample inappropriate? Was there excess argon? Can another isotope system test the result? Can we reproduce the error under the same conditions again? Can we identify when this method works, when it doesn't? And if we can predict its failure conditions, can we avoid these conditions? That is what science actually does. A dating method having circumstances where it produces a bad result doesn't prove that it never produces a good one. Carbon dating works the same way. There's real examples of organisms producing bizarrely old carbon dates. Marine animals can incorporate older carbon from ocean reservoirs. So the freshwater organisms can absorb the ancient carbon dissolved from the limestone. So you can test something that's alive or recently dead and get an apparent age of hundreds, thousands, sometimes even tens of thousands of years. And that sounds devastating if you stop the story there, but the scientists don't stop there. They asked why, and they discovered reservoir effects. Then they measured them. They compared the samples, they built calibration systems, they identified unsuitable materials, and rejected results when the assumptions weren't met. The weird result became information. That's the part I wasn't really being taught to follow all the way through, and this is where I finally understand why I didn't catch the problem as a child, even though I had already loved science. Ordinary science was trustworthy. Chemistry worked, anatomy worked, taxonomy worked, experiments worked. But whenever the evidence approached one specific conclusion, biblical chronology, the rules changed. If science supported the interpretation, it was evidence. If science contradicted the interpretation, suddenly we were supposed to interrogate the scientist's assumptions. But we were never supposed to interrogate the protected interpretation with the same intensity. Those ideas were basically living in different mental boxes. One box said a hypothesis should be testable, evidence can overturn an explanation, and then the other said God created the world a few thousand years ago, so any evidence that contradicts this must have some flaw. And nobody put those two sentences next to each other and asked me why they were compatible. Then public school forced those two boxes together. And when I brought that conflict home, the explanation I got was basically, your Apologia book's right. Public schools can't mix religion with education, so they have to teach secular science. Give them the billions of years answers that they want on the test, but remember the truth that you were already taught. And that created an almost perfect circular system. Start with, our interpretation is correct. Then scientific evidence contradicts it. So that science must be secular and anti-God. And how do we know our interpretation is still correct? Because the anti-God scientists disagree with it. The conclusion protects itself. If science agrees with you, science confirms your belief. If science disagrees with you, the disagreement confirms your belief. There is no possible result that forces you to reconsider the conclusion. That is not falsifiable reasoning. And this is why being scientifically curious didn't protect me, because the issue wasn't whether I understood experiments. It was who I had been taught I was allowed to trust about reality. I was a child. The adults around me trusted this curriculum. My adoptive parents were preachers, biblical scholars. The textbook presented itself as science. And before I ever encountered mainstream evidence, I had already been given an explanation for why mainstream scientists would disagree with me. So, contrary evidence didn't automatically register as new information, update your model. It registered as, this is the secular worldview you were warned about. That is an incredibly difficult framework for a child to reason their way out of. And eventually that left me with what I thought were only two choices. Either Christianity is true, scientific evidence has to be wrong, or the science is right, and Christianity, and probably God, must be wrong. I did not understand that I was allowed to believe that God created the universe and the earth is more than 6,000 years old. At the same time, and this is one of the things that surprised me when I later studied Islam, Islam didn't require me to reject an ancient earth. It did not require me to pretend evolution didn't happen. And the Quran did not present revelation as something that suddenly began with Judaism, Christianity, or even Islam. It's something much broader that it says. Quran 16:36 said God sent a messenger to every community. And Quran 10:47 says that every community had a messenger. And Quran 40:78 tells Muhammad that there were messengers before him, some of whose stories were told to him, and others whose stories were not. So according to Islam, human religious history should actually be much larger than the handful of prophets whose names survived in the Abrahamic traditions. And that gets incredibly interesting when you look at archaeology, because civilizations long before Christianity and Islam already had religious traditions containing familiar themes: creation stories, flood stories, divine judgment, sacred law, humanity's relationship with the divine. Mesopotamian flood traditions existed before the surviving biblical accounts of Noah. So what does that prove? This is where I think people make the same mistake from the opposite directions. One side says, see, the Bible copied older religions, so God isn't real. The other side says, no, our religion has to be totally unique, so those similarities must not matter. But archaeology doesn't actually require either conclusion. Archaeology can show that similar traditions existed. It can show which surviving texts are older. It can show trade, migration, conquest, shared language, culture exchange. It can show stories being adapted over time, but archaeology cannot dig up a tablet and scientifically determine this story was originally revealed by God. That is not something that archaeology can test. A secular historian can look at similarities between Mesopotamian traditions and later biblical traditions and say these cultures influenced one another, and they probably did. People traded, migrated, intermarried, conquered one another, translated stories, changed languages, built political institutions around religion. Human beings have been remixing culture for a very long time. But as a Muslim, I can look at the exact same archaeological evidence and make an additional theological inference. In the Quran, it says God sent messengers to people whose prophets we no longer know. Then I don't have to believe revelation began with Moses. Some earlier cultures could preserve fragments of older revelation. Could I scientifically prove that? No. Could I point to an ancient Sumerian figure and declare that person was definitely an unnamed prophet of Allah? Also no. That would be me taking theology and pretending archaeology had provided it. I don't want to reproduce the same intellectual mistake that I'm criticizing. Science has to be allowed to stop where the evidence stops. My faith can go farther. But I should be honest that I am making that additional metaphysical step. Judaism itself also did not emerge in a cultural vacuum. Ancient modern-day Israel, inside the wider Canaanite and Near Eastern world, its language, literature, law, religious traditions interacted with the surrounding cultures. Christianity later emerges from Second Temple Judaism. Jesus was Jewish. His earliest followers were Jewish. And as Christianity spread through the Greek and Roman-speaking world, its institutions, theology, language, and interpretations continued developing. Then Islam appears centuries later, and Islam does not say God finally decided to introduce himself. It claims continuity. Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, Jesus, Muhammad, the other messengers whose names we don't even know. Muhammad is not presented as inventing a new God. He's presented as another messenger calling people back to the same one. And that makes me wonder whether religious history makes more sense as a cycle than a clean timeline. Maybe it isn't simply Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Maybe it looks more like revelation, transmission, culture, politics, language changes, practices accumulate, interpretations diverge, some teachings survive, others change or disappear. People begin treating intermediaries, saints, rulers, ancestors, or spiritual beings differently over generations, and eventually another messenger calls people back to monotheism. That's an Islamic theological interpretation. I believe that Islam is correct, but archaeology has not scientifically proven that cycle, and I think that distinction matters. The same distinction finally allowed me to understand evolution. Evolution is not a scientific theory about whether God exists. It explains biological change. Mutations happen. Natural selection happens. Genetic drift happens. Populations diverge. Over enough generations, populations can become separate species. None of that scientifically answers why does a universe capable of producing life exist at all. God's not a competing biological mechanism. If I say God created life, that's not an alternate explanation to a mutation or natural selection in the same category. One's a metaphysical claim about ultimate cause and purpose, and the other is a scientific description of physical process. So today, I can believe that the universe is ancient. Earth, it might be billions of years old. Life evolved. Humans share ancestry with other life. Civilizations have risen and fallen. Ancient humans were far more intelligent and sophisticated than the caricature of primitive people that we sometimes inherit. Knowledge has been lost. Religious traditions influenced one another. Culture and politics changed religious practices, and human beings transmitted stories across enormous spans of times. And I can simultaneously believe that there's a creator. Those statements do not logically cancel each other out. Gravity describes how masses interact. It doesn't answer why existence exists. Evolution describes how populations change. It doesn't measure ultimate purpose. Archaeology can reconcile ancient religion. It cannot measure revelation. Eventually, we reach a boundary. On this side, physics, chemistry, biology, genetics, geology, archaeology, history, things we can observe and test. And then we reach questions those methods simply cannot answer. Was there intention behind existence? Does existence have ultimate purpose? Did God actually communicate with humanity? Was Muhammad receiving revelation? That is where I make the metaphysical jump, and personally I land on Islam. Not because carbon dating proved the Quran, not because archaeology excavated Allah, not because evolution demonstrates revelation. Because accepting those sciences no longer require me to deny God in the first place. And I think that's the biggest thing that I had to unlearn. I didn't lose faith because I learned too much science. I lost faith for a while because I'd been taught that if science was true, then God couldn't be, and that was the false choice. Now I can follow scientific evidence as far as the evidence actually goes. And when science honestly reaches a question its methods can't answer, I don't need to force science to become theology. I don't need to force theology to become bad science. That is where the faith begins.